Look at this satellite image. Where you see blackened earth and charred wreckage, there used to be a vibrant downtown, cafes, where people gathered for evening drinks, shops selling local goods, century-old buildings housing families who'd lived there for generations. Where you see twisted metal and ash, there used to be the Music Cafe, packed with patrons on a warm summer night, enjoying live music and conversation. This isn't a bombing site. This isn't a war zone. This is what happens when a railroad company decides that quarterly earnings matter more than human lives. 47 people died here. 5 of them were vaporized so completely by temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit that their bodies were never found. They simply ceased to exist in physical form, reduced to ash that scattered in the wind. Half the downtown was obliterated in minutes. Over 1.5 million gallons of crude oil ignited, creating fireballs that rose 200 feet into the night sky and could be seen from neighboring towns. 2,000 people were displaced. A community that took 130 years to build was destroyed in less than an hour. And here's what makes it unbearable. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't an unforeseeable tragedy or an act of God. This was the inevitable result of a railroad company, Montreal, Maine Atlantic Railway, that systematically prioritized profit over safety for years. They cut crews from 3 people to 1 to save salaries. They used cheap replacement parts that failed catastrophically. They ignored over 100 documented safety violations. They parked trains loaded with explosive cargo on slopes without adequate brakes. And when regulators warned them, when inspectors cited them, when their own employees raised concerns, they paid minimal fines, made cosmetic corrections, and continued operating exactly as before. Because shipping crude oil was lucrative, because fixing safety problems was expensive, because they'd been rolling the dice for years without consequence, and every successful run reinforced the belief that cutting corners was acceptable risk. Until one night in July 2013, when physics and negligence aligned perfectly, when every safety system had a failure, when probability caught up, and 47 people burned to death in their beds, in a cafe, on the streets, trying to run, paying the ultimate price for decisions made in distant boardrooms by executives who would never face criminal charges. July 5, 2013, 11 p.m., Nantes, Quebec. Tom Harding brings his train to a stop at the Nantes freight station, a small rail yard about 11 miles uphill from Lac Mégantic. He's 55 years old, an experienced engineer who's been running trains for decades. He knows this route, knows the procedures, knows his equipment. Tonight he's operating a freight composition from Montreal, Maine Atlantic Railway, 5 locomotives, pulling 72 tanker cars loaded with crude oil from the Bakken Formation in North Dakota. The train is nearly a mile long and weighs over 10,000 tons. Its cargo, 2.16 million gallons of highly flammable crude oil, is destined for Irving Oil's refinery in St. John, New Brunswick. The composition is massive, valuable, and dangerous. Under normal circumstances, a train like this would have a crew of 2 or 3, an engineer, a conductor, maybe a brakeman, multiple people to monitor systems, catch mistakes, handle emergencies. But Tom is alone. Just one person responsible for operating this rolling bomb through populated areas. This isn't unusual for MMA. The company has been aggressively cutting costs for years, and single-person crews are one of their favorite savings. Why pay 2 or 3 salaries when you can pay 1? Why maintain redundancy when you can squeeze a few more dollars out of every run? Tom parks the train on the main line, not on a protected siding with derails or buffer stops, but on the active main track, where trains normally pass through at speed. This violates standard railroad safety practices used by most other companies, but it's allowed under MMA's operating procedures. Parking on main lines saves time and money. No need to switch onto sidings. No need to install safety equipment that might catch a runaway train. Just park it and move on. Tom follows the parking procedure he's been trained to use. He engages the train's air brake system, which uses compressed air to lock all the wheels. This is the primary brake system. As long as air pressure remains in the brake lines, the wheels stay locked and the train can't move. Then he climbs out to manually apply hand brakes as a backup in case the air system fails. Hand brakes are simple mechanical devices. You turn a wheel that tightens a chain connected to the brake shoes, creating friction that holds the car in place. Each brake takes 3 to 4 minutes to apply properly and requires significant physical strength. It's exhausting work, especially when you're alone and tired after a long shift. Tom applies hand brakes on 7 cars, all 5 locomotives, the buffer car, and the first tanker car. Then he performs a brake test, releasing the air brakes briefly to verify the hand brakes alone can hold the train. The test seems to pass. The train doesn't move. Tom believes he's secured the train properly. What he doesn't realize is that he's accidentally left the air brakes partially engaged during the test, which masks the inadequacy of the hand brakes. 7 brakes might seem sufficient when you're testing with air brakes helping, but they're nowhere near enough to hold 10,000 tons on a slope by themselves. And the train is on a slope. The tracks from Nantes to Lac Mégantic drop consistently downhill, about 4 feet of elevation loss for every 100 yards. For a train this heavy sitting on this grade, railroad safety standards would typically require hand brakes on 15 to 20 cars, possibly more. 7 is dangerously insufficient. But Tom doesn't know this. He's been trained that 7 is acceptable. He's done it this way before without problems. And MMA's procedures written by management to save time and money say 7 is fine. But none of this matters yet, because the air brake system is fully functional and maintaining pressure. As long as the lead locomotive's engine keeps running, powering the air compressor that maintains brake pressure throughout the system, the train isn't going anywhere. Tom leaves the engine running for exactly this reason. It's standard procedure. Keep the engine on to maintain brake pressure until the next crew takes over, except there's a problem with that engine. And Tom has noticed, smoke is coming from the exhaust. More than usual, the engine sounds rough, like it's struggling. Tom reports the malfunction to US Rail Traffic Control, describing the smoke and the engine's poor performance. Then he contacts Richard Labrie, the local rail traffic controller on duty, confirms that the train is properly parked and secured, and heads to his hotel in Lac Mégantic for the night. Another crew will take over the train tomorrow morning for the next leg of the journey. Tom's shift is done. He's followed procedures, secured the train to the best of his knowledge, reported the engine problem. Everything seems in order. At 11:50 p.m., less than an hour after Tom leaves, the Nantes Fire Department receives an emergency call. The locomotive is on fire. Local residents near the rail yard report flames shooting from the lead engine, sparks flying into the night sky. The fire department responds immediately, arriving within minutes to find the locomotive fully involved in fire. Flames are pouring from the engine compartment. Smoke is thick and black. This isn't a small electrical fire or a minor malfunction. This is a serious engine fire that could spread to the tanker cars if not controlled quickly. Firefighters attack the blaze with water and foam, working to knock down the flames before they can reach the fuel tanks or spread to the train's cargo. To fully extinguish an engine fire, you have to shut down the engine itself, cut off its fuel supply and electrical systems so nothing can reignite. The firefighters do exactly this. They kill the engine, stopping its operation completely. The fire goes out, crisis averted. They've saved the train from burning. Or so they think, because what the firefighters don't understand, what nobody at the scene understands, is that by shutting down that engine, they've just initiated a countdown to catastrophe. With the engine off, the air compressor stops running. The compressed air brake system is no longer being repressurized. It's a closed system, but it's not perfectly sealed. Air slowly leaks from the brake lines through dozens of connections, valves, and seals distributed along nearly a mile of train. Normally this isn't a problem because the compressor continuously replaces the lost air, maintaining constant pressure. But now the compressor is off, the pressure is dropping, and when it drops below a critical threshold, the air brakes will automatically release. The firefighters notify rail traffic control that they've extinguished the fire. 2 MMA track maintenance workers arrive at the scene to inspect the train. These workers aren't train operators, they're maintenance personnel responsible for track upkeep, not train operations. They don't understand the air brake system's mechanics, They don't realize that shutting off the engine has created a ticking time bomb. They examine the locomotive, see that the fire is out, tell the firefighters everything is fine, and everyone leaves the scene. The train sits in the darkness, unattended, air pressure slowly bleeding away. If Tom Harding had been called back to the scene, he would have immediately understood the problem and restarted the engine to restore brake pressure, or at minimum applied additional handbrakes to compensate. But Richard Labrie, the traffic controller, tells Tom over the phone that MMA maintenance workers are handling it, and he doesn't need to return. Tom, exhausted and believing the situation is under control, goes to bed. Nobody calls him, nobody restarts the engine, nobody applies more handbrakes. The train is now held by 7 handbrakes alone, 7 brakes for 10,000 tons on a downhill grade, and they're not enough. July 6, 2013, 12:56 a.m. The air pressure in the brake lines has dropped below the critical threshold. The air brakes release throughout the train. All 72 tanker cars, previously locked in place by both air brakes and handbrakes, are now held only by 7 handbrakes. The 7 brakes create friction and resistance, but they're completely overwhelmed by the train's mass and the downhill slope. The train begins to move, slowly at first, just inches per minute, barely perceptible, but gravity is patient and relentless. The train picks up speed, a few inches per minute, becomes a few feet per minute, then tens of feet, then hundreds. The grade isn't steep, but it's consistent, and the train is monumentally heavy. Physics takes over. Momentum builds. The 7 handbrakes are like trying to stop a charging elephant with a rope. They create drag, but can't prevent the inevitable. The train rolls silently through the darkness. No headlights illuminate its path. No horn sounds warnings at crossings. No crew monitors its speed, or realizes what's happening. It's a ghost train, unmanned and accelerating, a mile-long bomb on wheels gathering momentum as it descends toward Lac Mégantic. Every second it travels farther. Every second it moves faster. By the time it's traveled a few miles, it's moving at 20, 30, 40 miles per hour, and still accelerating. Around 1 a.m., a firefighter who responded to the earlier locomotive fire is driving home through Nantes. He stops at a railroad crossing to let a train pass. As he waits, he recognizes it. It's the same train he helped extinguish just an hour ago. But something is terribly wrong. The train is moving at high speed, far faster than trains normally travel through this area. There are no lights, no horn, no sounds except the thunder of wheels on rails and the metallic screeching of brakes being overwhelmed. The train blows through the crossing and disappears into the night. The firefighter immediately grabs his radio and calls his supervisor. Something is wrong with that train. It shouldn't be moving. It definitely shouldn't be moving that fast. But before anyone can figure out what's happening, before anyone can contact rail control or warn the town's downline, before anyone can even fully process what they've witnessed, the runaway train reaches Lac Mégantic. It's a warm July night in Lac Mégantic, a picturesque town of about 6,000 people nestled in Quebec's eastern townships. The downtown area, a compact collection of shops, restaurants, apartments, and historic buildings, sits in a valley where the Chaudière River flows. Railroad tracks have run through the center of town since the 1800s, a vital connection to the outside world that brought prosperity and commerce. Most residents barely notice the trains anymore. They're part of the background, familiar and unremarkable. At the Moussi Café, one of downtown's popular gathering spots, the evening crowd is still enjoying drinks and conversation. It's just past 1 a.m., and while many people have gone home, the cafe is far from empty. Groups of friends occupy tables on the patio. Inside, patrons chat at the bar or listen to music playing through the sound system. The cafe sits just yards from the railroad tracks, close enough that passing trains rattle the windows, close enough that you can feel the vibration in the floor. But nobody pays attention to trains here. They pass regularly, day and night, hauling freight to and from the maritime provinces. It's background noise, like traffic on a highway. Then people hear something different. A train is approaching from the direction of Nantes, and it sounds wrong. Too loud, too fast. Wheels are screeching, not the normal rumble of a slow-moving freight train, but the tortured sound of metal grinding against metal, brakes being overwhelmed, physics approaching its limits. 5 locomotives flash past the cafe at impossible speed. Then come the tanker cars, 72 of them in a continuous chain, a mile-long string of cylindrical steel tanks, each one carrying 30,000 gallons of crude oil. The cars are swaying violently, rocking on their wheels, slamming into each other with metallic crashes that echo through downtown. People on the cafe patio stand up, looking toward the tracks in confusion and alarm. This isn't normal. Trains don't move this fast through town. Something is seriously wrong. The train is doing at least 65 miles per hour through downtown Lac Mégantic, where the speed limit for trains is 10 miles per hour. The reason for that low speed limit becomes immediately apparent. The tracks make a sharp curve right through the center of town, a curve designed for slow-moving trains, not for runaway freights traveling at 6 times the safe speed. The 5 lead locomotives make it through the curve. They're heavy, with low centers of gravity, their weight distributed across multiple wheels. They stay on the rails. The first few cars behind them manage as well, held in line by the locomotives pulling them. But the buffer car, a special car positioned behind the locomotives to protect crew from cargo in case of collision, though there's no crew tonight to protect, can't handle the lateral forces. The curve demands that the train change direction sharply, but the buffer car's momentum wants to continue straight. Physics wins. The car derails, its wheels lifting off the rails and dropping onto the trackbed, and once one car derails, the rest follow like dominoes. The buffer car is now dragging sideways, pulling the first tanker car off the tracks with it. That car pulls the next. Within seconds, 72 tanker cars are piling up in the center of Lac Mégantic, jackknifing, crushing against each other, crumpling like aluminum cans. The forces involved are immense. Each car weighs over 100 tons fully loaded, and they're all moving at 65 miles per hour. When they collide, metal tears like paper, seams split, welds fail, tank walls rupture. Then comes the first explosion. A massive fireball erupts from the derailment site, a brilliant orange sphere of flame that rises hundreds of feet into the night sky. The blast wave radiates outward in all directions, shattering every window in downtown, knocking people off their feet, collapsing parts of buildings nearest the tracks. The heat is unimaginable. At the epicenter, temperatures instantly exceed 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Trees burst into flame from radiant heat alone. Pavement melts, metal structures warp and twist. The Musée Café, sitting just yards from the tracks, takes the full force of the initial blast. The building simply disintegrates. Walls explode outward. The roof collapses. Most of the patrons inside, people who were laughing and talking and living just seconds before, are killed instantly. Some are vaporized by the heat, others are crushed by collapsing structure or shredded by flying debris. A few people near the exits survive by sheer luck, shielded by interior walls or thrown clear by the blast, but most don't. They cease to exist, their lives ending in a fraction of a second. The explosion is just the beginning. The ruptured tanker cars are hemorrhaging crude oil, over 1.5 million gallons pouring into the streets of downtown Lac Mégantic, and all of it is on fire. Crude oil burns hot and fast, and is extraordinarily difficult to extinguish. The spilled oil creates rivers of liquid fire, flowing downhill through downtown, following street grades and drainage patterns, spreading in every direction, igniting everything combustible it touches. Buildings ignite, not from direct flame contact initially, but from radiant heat. The temperatures near the derailment are so extreme that wood siding chars and catches fire from thermal radiation alone. Windows shatter from heat stress. Roofs begin smoking, then burst into flame. Within minutes, dozens of structures are burning simultaneously. The fires merge, creating a conflagration that generates its own weather. Superheated air rising rapidly, drawing in surrounding air, creating winds that spread flames even faster. Residents throughout downtown wake to apocalyptic scenes. Some describe it as looking like wartime bombing footage, like images from World War II firebombing raids. The sky is lit orange and red. Smoke is so thick you can barely breathe. The sound is overwhelming: roaring flames, exploding windows, collapsing buildings, people screaming. Heat is so intense that you can't get within blocks of the fire without feeling like your skin is burning. People flee their homes with nothing but the clothes they're wearing. Families run through smoke-filled streets, parents carrying children, elderly people struggling to move fast enough. Some people are overcome by smoke inhalation before they can reach safety. Others are trapped by spreading flames, forced to choose between routes that are all dangerous. Some jump from second and third story windows to escape burning buildings. Some survive the falls, others don't. Throughout this chaos, tanker cars continue exploding. Not all 72 cars ruptured in the initial derailment. Some remain intact, but are now cooking in the flames surrounding them. The crude oil inside heats up, expands, builds pressure. When the pressure exceeds what the tank walls can withstand, the car explodes violently. Not just ruptures but detonates, sending shrapnel hundreds of feet and releasing thousands of gallons of burning oil in an instant. Each explosion sends a fresh fireball into the sky, spreads more burning oil, creates new fires. Emergency services are immediately overwhelmed. The Lac Mégantic Fire Department is a small volunteer operation. Within minutes of the first explosion, they're calling for mutual aid from every surrounding community. Fire trucks converge from neighboring towns. Eventually about 150 firefighters respond with equipment. But when they assess the situation, they realize they're facing something beyond their capacity to control. The center of downtown is a sea of flames covering multiple city blocks. Crude oil is burning in streets, flowing through storm drains, igniting buildings, creating fires that conventional firefighting can't handle. You can't spray water on burning crude oil. Oil floats on water, so you just spread the flames. You need specialized foam retardant that suffocates the fire by cutting off oxygen, and there isn't enough foam in the entire region to handle a fire of this magnitude. Firefighters establish a perimeter, trying to prevent spread beyond downtown, protecting buildings on the periphery while the core burns. They can't approach the center. The heat is too intense, too dangerous. At 200 feet away, the radiant heat is enough to blister exposed skin. Equipment fails. Hoses burst. Firefighters work in brief rotations because the thermal exposure is unbearable. Saturday morning, a shipment of specialized foam retardant arrives from a nearby oil refinery. With this foam, crews finally make progress, attacking the main fire, but it's slow, exhausting work. They apply foam, it suffocates some flames, then wind shifts or oil trapped in drains reignites, and they have to start over. They work through Saturday and into Sunday, rotating shifts, fighting exhaustion and trauma as they realize that under all this fire and wreckage are dozens of bodies. The fire is finally declared extinguished late Sunday evening, July 7th, over 36 hours after the initial explosion. Downtown Lac Mégantic has been reduced to smoking ruins. A city to control. As investigators begin searching the ruins, the full horror emerges. 47 people died in the disaster. In the first days, 20 bodies are recovered, so badly burned that identification requires dental records or DNA testing. Many are found in what remains of the Musée Café. Others are found in nearby buildings or on streets where they were caught trying to flee. Over following weeks, 22 more sets of remains are found as cleanup crews carefully sift through debris. Some are just fragments, pieces of bone, teeth, anything that survived temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees. Forensic teams catalog every potential remain, use DNA to identify victims when possible. 5 people are never found. They were at ground zero when the tanker cars exploded. The temperatures were so extreme that their bodies were completely cremated, reduced to ash that scattered. These 5 victims have no remains to bury, no physical proof they ever existed, except the knowledge that they were there and then weren't. Their families have no closure, just absence. The hospital treats exactly 1 person for fire-related injuries, a man with second-degree burns, who walks in Saturday morning. 1. The fire left no middle ground. You were either far enough away to escape unharmed, or close enough to die. No burn victims in ICUs, no dramatic rescue stories, just 47 dead, and everyone else who survived untouched. 2,000 people are displaced, half the downtown, 40 buildings, is completely destroyed. Another 30 buildings are so damaged they must be demolished. The town's commercial heart, built over 130 years, is erased in less than an hour. Investigators from the Transportation Safety Board spend months reconstructing exactly what happened and why. What they discover is a cascade of failures, each individually significant but combined into catastrophe. The first failure is the cheap engine part. 8 months before the disaster, MMA sent the lead locomotive to a repair shop for engine problems. Instead of using manufacturer-specified parts, management authorized using a cheaper, lower-grade replacement to save money and time. They didn't want the locomotive sitting idle. Shipping crude oil was lucrative. That substandard part failed on July 5, allowing engine oil to leak into the turbocharger. With the engine running, oil accumulated and overheated until it ignited. That fire brought firefighters to the scene. That fire caused them to shut down the engine. That shutdown started the brake system losing pressure. The second failure is single-person crews. If 2 operators had been working, one could have stayed with the train while firefighters extinguished the fire. When the engine was shut down, a qualified operator would have restarted it immediately or applied additional hand brakes. But Tom was alone, and nobody called him back. The track workers who arrived weren't trained operators and didn't understand the consequences. The third failure is insufficient hand brakes. 7 brakes for 10,000 tons on a downhill grade. If Tom had applied the standard 15 to 20 brakes, the train would have held even after air brakes failed. But applying brakes is exhausting work when you're alone and tired. 7 seemed sufficient based on his test. It wasn't. The fourth failure is the flawed brake test. Tom tested with air brakes partially engaged, masking the inadequacy of hand brakes. If procedures had been more robust, or if a second person verified, the mistake would have been caught. The fifth failure is mainline parking. Standard practice is parking hazardous trains on protected sidings with derails or buffer stops. MMA policy allowed mainline parking to save time. No derails, no stops, nothing to catch a runaway. The sixth failure is MMA's safety culture. Over 100 documented violations in years before the disaster. Transport Canada cited them repeatedly for inadequate maintenance, insufficient training, improper procedures. MMA paid minimal fines, made cosmetic corrections, continued operating with known hazards, profit margins were tight. Safety was expensive, management chose revenue over risk reduction. The seventh failure is regulatory enforcement. Transport Canada knew about MMA's problems, had files full of violations and inspection reports, but they didn't force solutions. They issued warnings, levied fines, demanded plans. MMA complied minimally. The regulatory system was reactive, documenting problems without preventing disasters. Remove any one failure, and disaster likely doesn't happen. But all 7 aligned on July 5, 2013, and 47 people died. In May 2014, Quebec police arrest 3 men, Tom Harding, Richard Labrie, and Jean Demedra. Each faces 47 counts of criminal negligence, causing death. The prosecution argues they failed in their duties. Harding didn't apply enough brakes. Labrie didn't properly inspect after the fire. Demedra allowed inadequate procedures, but this narrative is fundamentally unfair. These men operated within a system designed by MMA management. They followed company procedures, worked under policies created to maximize profit and minimize costs. They were on duty when accumulated failures resulted in catastrophe, but they didn't create those failures. The trial begins in 2017. Defense attorneys present evidence of MMA's cost-cutting culture, its pattern of ignoring safety, its use of substandard parts, its inadequate training. They argue the 3 defendants did what they were trained to do, followed procedures they were given. If anyone deserves criminal charges, it's MMA executives who prioritized profit over safety. Lac Mégantic residents agree. Many testify supporting the defendants. They know Tom Harding, know these aren't reckless criminals but workers in impossible situations created by a company that didn't care. In January 2018, the jury delivers its verdict, not guilty on all counts for all three. The courtroom erupts in applause. Even some victims' families nod in agreement. These aren't the people who should be prosecuted. The real culprits, MMA executives, owners, the corporate culture, were never charged. Ed Burkhardt, MMA's CEO who architected the cost-cutting, faced no charges. Initially he blamed Tom publicly, calling him negligent. Later he softened but never accepted responsibility. MMA filed bankruptcy and dissolved, its leadership protected by corporate liability, insulated from consequences. Transport Canada moved quickly after the disaster, at least on paper. Within months, they announced sweeping new regulations, designed to prevent another Lac-Mégantic. Two-person minimum crews on all trains carrying dangerous goods. No more lone operators, like Tom Harding, working exhausted shifts with nobody to catch mistakes. Enhanced braking standards specifically for crude oil trains, requiring more reliable systems that don't depend solely on a running engine. Speed limits of 10 miles per hour or less through urban areas when hauling explosive materials. More frequent and thorough safety inspections of rail companies with poor safety records. Enhanced tanker car designs with thicker walls and better reinforcement to reduce rupture risk in derailments. The U.S. Federal Railroad Administration implemented parallel changes, recognizing that trains don't respect borders, and a disaster in Canada reveals vulnerabilities throughout North American rail systems. Major freight carriers, the Class 1 railroads that dominate continental shipping, publicly committed to the new standards. Politicians held press conferences praising the swift regulatory response. Regulators congratulated themselves on learning from tragedy and implementing reforms that would save future lives. The message was clear: Lac-Mégantic was a wake-up call, and the industry was responding. But here's what actually happened over the following decade. Railroad companies discovered the new regulations were expensive. Very expensive. Hiring second crew members for every hazardous cargo train meant doubling labor costs on those runs. Upgrading braking systems required retrofitting thousands of locomotives with new equipment. Enhanced tanker cars cost significantly more than standard designs. Manufacturers estimated a 20 to 30% price increase per car. Reduced speed limits through urban areas meant longer transit times and reduced efficiency. Every requirement had a price tag, and every price tag affected quarterly earnings. So the industry did what industries do when faced with expensive regulations: they lobbied. Railroad associations hired consultants to produce studies questioning whether the regulations were necessary or effective. They argued that single-person crews were perfectly safe with proper procedures and modern technology. They claimed enhanced tanker cars weren't significantly safer than existing designs. They insisted that speed limits would cripple shipping efficiency without meaningfully improving safety. They requested delays to study the issue further. They demanded exemptions for certain routes or cargo types. They challenged regulations in court, arguing regulatory overreach. And it worked, at least partially. Implementation timelines were extended. Standards were weakened in certain areas. Exemptions were granted. Railroad companies that had initially agreed to voluntary compliance found ways to minimize actual changes while maintaining the appearance of cooperation. By 2025, over a decade after Lac-Mégantic, many of the promised safety improvements still haven't been fully implemented across the industry. Single-person crews still operate in jurisdictions where they're technically legal, especially on smaller railroads that claim they can't afford additional labor costs. Some of the older, less safe tanker car designs are still in service because regulations allowed extended phase-out periods. Speed limits through populated areas are enforced inconsistently, with companies arguing that certain routes don't meet the threshold for restriction. The comprehensive safety culture transformation that seemed inevitable in 2013's immediate aftermath has been watered down to incremental, often cosmetic changes. The fundamental dynamic hasn't changed. Railroad companies still face relentless pressure from shareholders to maximize efficiency and minimize costs. Safety improvements that don't have immediate measurable returns on investment are still viewed as expenses to be minimized rather than imperatives to be prioritized. When companies have to choose between a safety upgrade that costs millions and reporting strong quarterly earnings, the earnings usually win. The same calculation that led MMA to use cheap engine parts and single-person crews still drives decision-making across the industry. And the regulators, they're better than they were, certainly. They're more aware, more attentive to warning signs, more willing to cite violations. But they still lack the authority or political will to shut down operations before disasters occur. They can fine companies, demand corrective action plans, increase inspection frequency, but they can't force fundamental cultural change. They can't make companies prioritize safety over profit. They can document problems and hope companies fix them voluntarily, and when companies don't comply, they can escalate enforcement, slowly, bureaucratically, always giving companies another chance to voluntarily improve. The economic pressures that led MMA to cut corners are still pushing railroads to cut corners. The regulatory system is still reactive rather than proactive, and trains still roll through populated areas, carrying explosive cargo, operated by crews working under the same cost pressures, maintained by companies making the same profit versus safety calculations that MMA made. Nobody wants another Lac Megantic, but wanting to prevent disaster and being willing to sacrifice profit to prevent disaster are two very different things. And more than a decade later, it's increasingly clear which one the industry values more. The financial calculus of lives. The settlement process revealed something disturbing about how our system values human life. MMA filed bankruptcy in August 2013, claiming it lacked assets to compensate victims. The company's total insurance coverage was approximately $25 million, a number that sounds substantial until you realize the disaster caused over $400 million in property damage alone. Add in business losses, environmental cleanup, long-term economic impact to the region, and you're approaching $1 billion in total damages. $25 million is 2.5% of that. It's insulting. So victims' lawyers did what they had to cast the widest possible legal net. They sued Canadian Pacific Railway, the major carrier that contracted MMA for this shipping route. They sued the Bakken oil producers, whose crude was on the train. They sued World Fuel Services, the broker who arranged the shipment. They sued the companies that manufactured the tanker cars. They sued Irving Oil, the intended recipient. They even sued the town of Nantes for allegedly inadequate fire response. The legal theory was simple: find everyone with any connection to the disaster, bring them into the suit, and hope their combined insurance policies and corporate assets provide meaningful compensation. And it worked, sort of. Companies settled to avoid prolonged litigation and the risk of massive jury verdicts. Canadian Pacific contributed $22 million, despite arguing they weren't directly responsible. MMA was an independent contractor they hired, not a subsidiary they controlled. The crude oil producers contributed. Tanker car manufacturers contributed. The town of Nantes paid $10 million. Various insurance companies contributed their policy limits. By 2015, a settlement fund totaling approximately $450 million USD had been assembled. That's a substantial sum in absolute terms. But divide it among 47 families of the deceased, plus dozens of survivors who lost homes, businesses, and livelihoods, and the individual amounts become less impressive. The settlement formula considered factors like the victim's age, earning potential, dependence, and other circumstances. A 24-year-old with decades of future earnings received more than a 93-year-old retiree. Someone who left behind young children received more than someone who lived alone. The calculations were coldly actuarial. How much economic value did this person have? How much income would they have earned over their remaining lifespan? How much should we pay their family for the loss? These formulas try to be objective, to treat everyone fairly according to measurable criteria, but they can't capture what was actually lost. How do you value the 24-year-old's unrealized potential, the career they never built, the family they never raised, the contributions they never made? How do you value the 93-year-old grandmother's wisdom, her role as family anchor, the hole her death creates in 3 generations of descendants? The legal system tries, using spreadsheets and life expectancy tables and earning projections, but everyone involved knows the truth. No amount of money is adequate compensation for a human life cut short by corporate negligence. And MMA itself, the company that actually caused the disaster, they paid virtually nothing. The bankruptcy process liquidated MMA's remaining assets, locomotives, rail cars, office equipment, real estate, and distributed the proceeds to creditors. The secured creditors with first claim on assets got some recovery. Unsecured creditors got pennies on the dollar. Victims were at the bottom of the priority list. By the time assets were distributed according to bankruptcy law, there was almost nothing left for the people who actually suffered from MMA's negligence. The executives and owners who made the decisions that killed 47 people paid nothing personally. They were protected by corporate liability shields. The legal fiction that a corporation is a separate entity from its owners and managers. You can sue the corporation, and if you win, you can claim the corporation's assets, but you can't touch the personal assets of the people who ran the corporation, unless you can prove they personally committed fraud or other specific crimes. Cost-cutting that kills people isn't fraud. Using cheap parts isn't criminal. Ignoring safety violations isn't prosecutable unless you can prove specific criminal intent. Ed Burkhardt, MMA's chairman and CEO, walked away from Maine without facing criminal charges. The man who architected the single-person crew policy, who approved using substandard engine parts, who oversaw operations while safety violations accumulated, who created the corporate culture that prioritized profit over safety, he faced no legal consequences. He initially tried to blame Tom Harding publicly, suggesting the engineer had tampered with brakes or violated procedures. When that narrative fell apart under scrutiny, he softened his tone but never accepted personal responsibility. He eventually retired quietly, his personal wealth intact, his freedom never threatened. This is the message Maine sends to corporate executives. You can run a company with documented safety violations, ignore regulatory warnings, implement policies that directly lead to mass death, and face no personal consequences, as long as you're protected by corporate structure. The company might fail, you might lose your job, your reputation might suffer in certain circles, but you won't go to prison, you won't lose your personal assets, you won't pay any meaningful price for the deaths you caused through negligence and cost-cutting. The workers get arrested. The engineers and traffic controllers and operations managers who followed corporate procedures get charged with criminal negligence. But the executives who created those procedures, they're protected, they're insulated, they're safe. Tom Harding's burden. Tom Harding never worked as a train engineer again. How could he? Even after the not guilty verdict, even after the investigation revealed the systemic failures that were beyond his control, even after his community rallied around him and expressed understanding, he still can't escape what happened. He followed procedures, he applied the brakes he was trained to apply, he performed the test he was taught to perform, he reported the engine problem, he confirmed with the traffic controller that everything was secure, he did everything MMA trained him to do, and 47 people died anyway. The rational part of his mind understands that he was a scapegoat, that MMA's cost-cutting policies created the conditions for disaster, that the cheap engine part and single-person crews and inadequate procedures were decisions made far above his level. He understands that if anyone should carry guilt, it's the executives who designed a system destined to fail eventually. He understands that 7 hand brakes seemed sufficient based on his training and the test results, that having a second crew member would have caught the problem, that proper maintenance would have prevented the engine fire, that parking on a protected siding would have stopped the runaway train. He understands all of this intellectually, but understanding doesn't erase the fundamental fact: it was his train. He was the last person to touch those brakes. He was the one who parked it and walked away, and then it rolled downhill and killed 47 people. He dreams about it, not every night anymore, but often enough. In the dreams he's back at the Nantes rail yard, applying brakes in the darkness. Sometimes he applies more brakes, but they still fail. Sometimes he sees the train beginning to move and runs after it, unable to catch it. Sometimes he's in Lac Mégantic when the explosion hits, watching people burn, unable to help. He wakes up sweating, heart pounding, the guilt crushing. During the day, he avoids downtown Lac Mégantic. He lives in the area, he can't afford to move, and why should he have to leave his home because of MMA's failures? But he plans routes that don't take him past the memorial or through the rebuilt downtown. Seeing those streets, even now, with new buildings and new businesses, triggers memories of the aftermath, the smoke, the flames, the realization that his train had caused all of this. People in town largely support him. They testify at his trial. They speak publicly about his character, about knowing him for years, about understanding that he was following company procedures. But he still feels their eyes on him sometimes, still wonders if they're really thinking, if he had just applied one more brake, two more, three more, if he had just been more careful, more thorough, more paranoid about the possibility of failure. The not guilty verdict provides legal vindication, but doesn't erase the emotional burden. He's not criminally responsible. The jury agreed. The investigation confirmed. The community understands. But he still wakes up at night, still sees those flames, still carries the weight of 47 deaths. Vindication doesn't resurrect the dead. Understanding doesn't fill the empty chairs at dinner tables. Legal exoneration doesn't stop the dreams. He'll carry this for the rest of his life. Not because he deserves to. The real guilt belongs with MMA's executives who created a system designed to fail, but because he was there, because it was his train, because his hands were the last to touch those brakes, because 47 people are dead, and someone has to remember them, someone has to carry the weight, even if that someone was just another victim of MMA's negligence. More than a decade after Lac Mégantic, certain questions still haunt everyone involved. The official investigation answered the technical questions. What failed mechanically? What procedures were violated? What decisions led to disaster? But the deeper questions, the human questions, remain unanswered, and perhaps unanswerable. Could Tom Harding have prevented it? If he had applied 15 handbrakes instead of 7, would the train have held? Almost certainly yes. But he applied 7, because that's what he was trained to do. What MMA's procedures said was sufficient, what had worked successfully on previous runs. Is it his fault for following inadequate training, or MMA's fault for providing inadequate training? Could the firefighters have prevented it? If they had known that shutting off the engine would cause brake failure, they could have restarted it, or immediately called for additional brakes to be applied. But they weren't train operators. They were firefighters responding to an engine fire, doing what firefighters do, extinguish fires. Is it their fault for not understanding railroad brake systems, or MMA's fault for not having qualified personnel present to handle the situation? Could Richard Labray have prevented it? If he had insisted that Tom Harding return to the scene after the fire, or if he had sent a qualified operator to verify the train was secure, or if he had personally inspected the train instead of relying on track maintenance workers, the brake pressure problem might have been discovered in time. But he followed company protocols. Is it his fault for trusting those protocols, or MMA's fault for creating inadequate protocols? Could Transport Canada have prevented it? If regulators had forced MMA to fix its 100+ documented safety violations, if they had shut down operations until systemic problems were resolved, if they had been more aggressive in enforcement, the disaster wouldn't have happened. But regulators are always balancing safety against economic concerns, always facing pressure not to be too restrictive, always reluctant to put companies out of business. Is it their fault for not being aggressive enough, or the political system's fault for not giving regulators sufficient authority? These questions have no satisfying answers, because the disaster wasn't caused by any single person or single decision. It was caused by a system, a corporate system that prioritized profit over safety, a regulatory system that documented problems without forcing solutions, an economic system that rewarded cost-cutting and punished safety investments, a legal system that protected executives while prosecuting workers. Everyone involved was operating within a broken system. Tom Harding was following procedures that were designed to minimize labor costs rather than maximize safety. The firefighters were responding to an emergency without information about the train's critical systems. Richard Labray was coordinating operations according to company protocols. The regulators were enforcing regulations that companies had successfully lobbied to weaken. Nobody woke up that morning intending to kill 47 people. Everyone was just doing their job within a system that was designed to eventually fail, and that's perhaps the most disturbing lesson of Lac Mégantic. It wasn't a case of bad people doing bad things. It was a case of normal people doing normal things within a broken system, and the system failing catastrophically, which means it can happen again. It will happen again, unless the underlying system changes, and more than a decade later, the system remains fundamentally unchanged. The question isn't whether another disaster like Lac Mégantic will occur. The question is when and where, because the conditions that created the disaster still exist throughout the railroad industry. Companies still face pressure to cut costs. Single-person crews still operate in many jurisdictions. Crude oil and other hazardous materials still move through populated areas on aging infrastructure. Regulators still lack the authority or will to force systemic change before disasters occur. There have been close calls since 2013, derailments that could have been catastrophic but weren't, either through luck or quick response, near misses that generated brief news coverage and prompted promises of improvement, then faded from public attention. The industry points to these near misses as evidence that current safety measures work. Critics point to them as evidence that we're still rolling the dice, still gambling that probability will stay favorable. Somewhere right now, there's probably a train with inadequate brakes parked on a slope. Somewhere there's an operator working alone on a hazardous cargo run, exhausted after a long shift, following procedures designed to save money rather than maximize safety. Somewhere there's a railroad company ignoring maintenance issues because fixing them is expensive. Somewhere there's a regulator documenting violations but not forcing corrections because shutting down operations is politically difficult. All the elements that aligned in Lac Mégantic are still present in the system. The holes in the Swiss cheese are still there, waiting to align again. Maybe they'll align in Texas, where crude oil trains run through populated areas on tracks maintained by companies facing the same economic pressures MMA faced. Maybe in North Dakota, where oil production means constant rail traffic through small towns. Maybe in Alberta, where tar sands extraction creates similar shipping patterns. The location will be different. The specific failure modes might vary. The names of the victims will change, but the underlying cause will be the same. A system that treats safety as an expense rather than an imperative, that prioritizes short-term profit over long-term risk reduction, that allows companies to gamble with public safety as long as disasters remain statistically unlikely. Lac Mégantic killed 47 people and taught us exactly what needs to change to prevent future disasters. Some 1,000 character video bitige. So here's the question we leave you with. How many MMA railways exist right now? How many railroad companies are cutting corners on safety, running single-person crews on hazardous cargo, using cheap replacement parts, parking trains with inadequate brakes on slopes through populated areas? How many regulators are documenting violations without forcing corrections? How many small towns have freight trains rolling through their downtowns, carrying explosive materials, needing only the right combination of failures to align? The Lac Mégantic 47, ranging from 24 to 93 years old, killed in their beds, in a cafe, on the streets trying to flee, can't answer those questions, but their sacrifice demands we ask them. Their legacy demands we learn from their deaths. Their memory demands we do better. Every July 6th at 1:15 a.m., bells toll 47 times in Lac Mégantic, Quebec. Listen carefully. It's not just commemorating the past, it's warning about the future. Because somewhere right now, another train is rolling through another town, operated by another company, making the same calculations that killed 47 people, and the dice are still being rolled. If you found this investigation as important and sobering as we did, subscribe to the channel. We examine industrial disasters where corporate negligence and systemic failures combined in the worst possible way, not to sensationalize tragedy, but to understand what failed and why. So maybe, just maybe, we can prevent the next runaway train, the next burning town, the next 47 deaths. Each of you watching helps keep these stories alive. Thank you for remembering Lac Mégantic with us today.